So here's where we are so far. We've produced two, let's call them attention maps, graphs simply of the fraction of articles that include coverage of these two terms over time. By looking at these graphs, learning to read them, we can tell a few simple stories. First of all, we identify unusual features of the archives. So The Guardian, for example, in this early 1800s period, where they have anomalously high rates of talking about capitalism that shift quite dramatically, and suddenly that we associate with a change in ownership of the newspaper. So the sort of micro history, let's say, of The Guardian in that particular period. We're also able to track the impact of historical events. We can look at the fact that, or we can look at the effect of the Russian Revolution on mass culture and how, or at least quasi-elite mass culture, and how capitalism is being discussed. We can have some interesting things happen when we think about the coverage of democracy with respect to war. So we see this spike during the American Civil War. We see a spike during World War I. We see a spike at the beginning and the end of World War II. Interestingly, we also see a spike in coverage of democracy during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And worryingly, the current rates, at least in the New York Times, of democracy talk are the highest they've ever been, in fact, since the beginning of World War II. So make of that what you will. These are sort of things that the archives have thrown up for us. We've decided to operationalize attention simply through the frequency of articles that include the word. And we're sort of getting something out the other side that's telling us at least that this operationalization is tracking something potentially of interest. There's something here that we're learning a little bit about how different newspapers in different countries and different eras choose to cover things. That said, we aren't yet ready, or we are not yet ready to answer the original research question, which was not about the changing rates of attention to these two terms, but how these terms are connected together conceptually. Not just are people talking about capitalism or are people talking about democracy, but to what extent people are connecting these two things conceptually. To what extent are people saying that somehow, in order to talk about or understand capitalism, we also need to talk or understand democracy, and vice versa. So at this point, all we've done is examine these tracks independently. We now come back to solve this problem by a new operationalization. So the first thing we did was we operationalized attention as word frequency. Now we're going to operationalize linkage, conceptual linkage, in terms of something we're going to call co-occurrence. So co-occurrence is going to be a mathematical thing. I'll show you how to measure it in a moment. Co-occurrence is going to tell you, roughly speaking, is the word capitalism occurring more or less often in the same article with democracy? So what's going on here? Obviously, simply because two words co-occur in an article doesn't mean that they're being necessarily linked conceptually. But the operationalization says, that's not a bad way to start tracking it. So what's the justification for this operationalization? Roughly speaking, if people think concept A and concept B are related to each other, well, they're going to talk about them in the same article. They're going to speak of them in the same breath, let's say. In this case, our unit of analysis being the single newspaper article. Sort of a justification. If you see that talk about A and talk about B tend to be in the same articles, that's potentially a sign that people are drawing them together. Conversely, if I never talk about them together, if whenever I talk about A, there's no talk about B to be seen anywhere, well, maybe this is a sign that in fact people don't mentally connect these ideas. Now again, this is an approximation. This is perhaps even worse than an approximation. There's a whole raft of assumptions that go behind the linkage or the connection between this rich concept of people conceptually linking things together, thinking that there's something about democracy that has something to do with capitalism, or that there's something that matters about capitalism when you talk about democracy. Those are rich things, right? That's what you go to college to study. But this operationalization says, let's just cash that out. Let's attempt to track it simply by looking at word co-occurrence, the extent to which words appear in the same article. The justifications, in one sense, the proof's in the pudding, you might say. In other cases, depending upon your audience, you may try to justify these with a richer, more theoretical backing. A psychologist, a cognitive scientist would try to say, words that go together are mean together, things that co-occur, co-mean. There may be, hiding behind these all sorts of underlying results from laboratory experiments, that sort of thing. But what I want you to pay attention to here is not necessarily whether the justification is good or bad, simply that we have to make this move because computers don't know what a concept is. We have to translate the rich thing into the weak thing, right? And we have to provide some kind of justification. We may not be called upon to do that in the main article itself, but there will always be somebody when you give a lecture on this who will demand to know more about these sorts of things. There will always be weaknesses. The most obvious weakness, at least to me, is that we're tracking not concepts, but words. So we're at two removes here. We're not just saying, we have to say, two things. First is, we want to track the concept. We're going to look for the word that's associated with the concept. So of course, synonyms, circumlocutions, if they're persistent, won't work. And then we're going to track the linkage between concepts, how concepts are connected by the extent to which words tend to appear together. So now let's talk about how we can measure, quantify the extent to which words appear together. So here's an example. So I've just yanked this out of 1933. This is the New York Times. In the center of the screen here, you'll see, Sergeant Johnson wins Chief Prize at Exhibition by Negro artists, sponsored by the Harvard Foundation. Smith students again make teaching preferred vocation up in the left. Times have changed. Egyptians welcome, right? So, but in the center here, you have an article, and this was one that was already pulled out by our analysis. When we searched and counted the number of articles in 1933 that contained the word capitalism, this article came up. Another article that came up, this article also came up when we searched for the word democracy, and that's because the article also contains the word democracy. So let's just take a look in here. This is a Catholic father, Catholic priest, making a speech. This is a report of a speech talking about the need for a robust defense of capitalism in order to protect American democracy in the face of the menace of communism. What we're seeing here is simply that this article, at least we're going to operationalize the linkage that Father Walsh makes. We're going to operationalize this as and it's very sorry, Father, but just the fact that you use the word democracy and you use the word capitalism. The fact that democracy and capitalism co-appear in your article is going to be a signal for us that there is some conceptual linkage being made. So what can we do? Well, already you know how to do the following. You know how to measure the probability that an article talks about capitalism. That's simple. You count up the number of articles in that year that contain the word, and you divide by an estimate of the total number of articles. That's an estimation, just by the by, and David Kinney will talk about this at length. That's an estimation of the probability. You also know how to measure the probability that an article talks about democracy. Now, however, we have the second or sort of following question, which is, what is the probability that the word capitalism and the word democracy appear together in the same newspaper article? So the way we notate that is having written P capitalism, probability of capitalism, and P democracy, probability of democracy. We write this as, just in shorthand, the P capitalism, comma, democracy. That's just a way to write shorthand what we see on the left-hand side of the screen. How do we measure that? Again, quite simple. We will estimate the probability simply by counting the number of articles that have both words divided by the total number of articles in that year. This measure here, so we can measure this off the data, we're going to compare this value, the probability of a joint appearance of the two words in an article, to a null model. And in particular, we're going to compare this number here, the probability of capitalism and democracy, to the probability that the word capitalism and the word democracy appeared in an article if those two words were being used in a totally uncorrelated fashion. Okay, so what does uncorrelated mean? One way to think about it is, let's imagine that the appearance of a word in an article is just a completely random event like the toss of a coin. So I have a coin, I toss it. If it comes up heads, capitalism is in the article. I toss a second coin, right? And if it comes up heads, I put democracy in the article. The question we now have is, what is the probability that capitalism and democracy both appear in that article if all I've done is toss two coins? Well, if the coins are 50-50, then the probability of getting capitalism in the article is 50%. Probability of getting democracy in the article is 50%. The probability that they both enter the article, the same article, is you got to get heads twice. So it's 50% times 50%, 0.5 times 0.5. So in fact, 0.25, right? 1 in 4 times under that model, capitalism and democracy will co-appear. Now, capitalism, the word, and capitalism, democracy are actually much rarer than 50-50. They're somewhere, as you remember from the graphs, they fluctuated. Capitalism was quite rare, like 0.1 to 1%, democracy 0.5 to 3%. But this general idea that the probability that capitalism appears and the probability that democracy appears simultaneously, if they're otherwise independent, is simply the product of the probability of capitalism times the probability of democracy. Okay. So now we have two numbers here. Right? We have a measure of the actual co-occurrence of the two words, and we have an estimate of the probability that the words co-occur if they were not being used in any connected fashion. So this null model is basically saying, well, let's say that these two things, people just use them randomly. They didn't try to use them together, nor did they try to use them separately. Right? So we have these two numbers. We're going to measure the level of connection between the two words as the ratio. So we'll call this R. R here is the ratio between the measured probability of seeing the word capitalism and the word democracy in the same article. So we measure the top of this ratio off of the data. We do a lot of searches. So we say 1933, New York Times, tell me how many articles had both the word capitalism and the word democracy in. So the top line we measure. The bottom, right, on the lower half of the fraction, the denominator of the fraction, we measure the probability of capitalism alone times the probability of democracy alone. And then we take the ratio. So I'm going to show you a graph now. This is a derived quantity, this R, right? The fraction, the ratio of co-usage compared to the independence hypothesis. So on the x-axis here is year. So we begin in 1890 and we go forward up to our data stop just after 2015. Here's the New York Times track. That's the blue line as before. Here's the Guardian, the red line. Here's NRC Handelsblad. The scale here is a sort of stretched scale. You can see this point here, this is 1. So at this point here, this is where you would be if the words capitalism and democracy were being used as if they were being used independently in this sort of like random coin tossing null hypothesis. So this graph contains an enormous amount of information that we can now use to do some interpretations to kind of make sense of what's going on in these three newspapers, in these three cultures over the course of, in this case, I've narrowed it down here just to the last century. Let's take the sort of most obvious things on this graph first. It's always a good idea before you start getting clever just to say obvious things. The first thing you can see here is that you have these three lines, ochre, red, and blue. And ochre, right, the Dutch, is higher than the red, the English, British, which is higher than the blue, the Americans. The Dutch talk about democracy and capitalism together relative to baseline much more often than the Americans do. So this is a kind of a complex ratio here. This is not saying that the Dutch talk about capitalism more, or that the Dutch talk about democracy more, or even that there are, by fraction, more articles containing capitalism and democracy in NRC versus the Times. What this is telling you is that when democracy and capitalism are talked about in the NRC, they're more often, relative to baseline, talked about together. And in fact, these numbers are quite high. So if you take NRC here, so this is a factor of 10. So before the Second World War, you're kind of at this line here. The Dutch are basically, here's 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe 50. The Dutch are linking together the words capitalism and democracy about 40 times more often than they would if they were not using these words in a connected fashion. So this is a very high level of, let's call it linkage, where when you see the word capitalism, it's much, much more likely that you're also going to see the word democracy. Here's the Guardian, right? The Guardian sort of, it's not factors of 40, it's more like factors of 10 or 20, right? So the Guardian is connecting these two words. The co-occurrence ratio of these two words is not as high as the Dutch, but one thing you can certainly see is that it's a lot higher than the Americans. Right? So both the Brits and the Dutch are connecting together these two words, linking them at least in a frequency sense, these words much more than the Americans are. And in fact, beginning at around 1900, the Americans are almost using these words independently. Right? They're almost at this sort of level here of 1, meaning 1890, they're only twice as likely to co-appear than they would be if, in fact, these words had nothing to do with each other. Over time, you can see the Americans start to rise, and in fact, between 1900 and around 1940, this is where these things start to get linked together. Interestingly enough, if you look at the articles up here, a lot of them look like that Father Welsh article where the article was really talking about the impact of the Depression, the fact that capitalism had apparently seemed to fail, and the difficulties that would cause for the survival of American democracy. You might say another way to put it is the NRC data is suggesting that the word the word capitalism is more politicized than the word democracy. I should say, by the way, that of course, NRC being in Dutch rather than English, we're using the translations of these words as close as we can. And we're also making sure not to, as you have to be careful, not to connect, not to have an overlap between the word democracy and a word that might appear in the name of a political party that often happens in European parties. So there's some work that's been done here. After World War II, however, these gaps between the Brits, the Dutch, and the Americans, these gaps here start to decline. You see a very rapid decline right after World War II in the Dutch. They go almost immediately down to the British levels of conceptual linkage. These now actually track each other pretty well, so the cultural style of the British and the Dutch is actually quite similar now. Both of them decline until, in fact, around, let's say, 1979 or so, when you reach a point where the conceptual linkages, as operationalized by word co-occurrences, the conceptual linkages that were so different, orders of magnitude, factors of 10, 20, even 30 between the Dutch, the Brits, and the Americans, those differences have now shrunk to almost nothing, statistically almost indistinguishable, somewhere around this point here. This, if we were to do just a mild bit and sort of step a little bit out of bounds now, to try to do some interpretation of this result, if you believe the idea that this R ratio here is tracking the way in which people or mass culture is connecting democracy and capitalism, this is somewhere around what you might think of as the origin of neoliberalism as a mass phenomenon. This is your beginning of your Reagan and Thatcher era, most obviously in the West, where the idea that capitalism and democracy needed to be made sense of together, meaning that somehow we had to discuss whether or not, let's say, they were compatible. This is now at its lowest ebb. All three of these countries have merged to an American style of conceptual structure, measured at the very least on these very broad, rough, operationalized scales. So, where are we now? We began in this set of videos with what I claimed was our research question. How do people link the concepts of capitalism and democracy? I suggest that these would be interesting. That kind of question is interesting from the point of view of intellectual history, from the point of view of a political scientist, and also from the point of view of a cultural historian, someone who studies mass media. We began there. I introduced some very simple tools, although we'll repeat and go back forth on these questions in some of the homework examples. And David Kinney will give you a deeper philosophical introduction to the idea of using probabilities as a way to talk about epistemic states. In operationalizing this research question in that way, making some graphs, discovering things, our question mutated somewhat. We began with, okay, what are we doing together? Well, we want to see how people use these words together as a way to get at how they link the concepts together. When we actually came around to looking at what the data told us, our question had changed perhaps. And one thing you might say is, actually our research question is not how do people link these concepts together, but when and how did they stop? Because early on, at least apparently in our data, there was a very high rate of co-discussion. When people talked about democracy, particularly in the Dutch case, less so in the British case, but even in the American case, people talked about these things together. When you wanted to talk about capitalism, you ended up being much more likely to talk about democracy. The co-occurrences, these two terms, if this is, here's all the times you use capitalism, here's all the times you use democracy, what that R ratio is what that R ratio is saying is that in fact all these instances are starting to appear in the same articles. Over time, however, as the 19th century turns into the 20th century, as the pre-war turns into the post-war, turns into the Cold War, now it looks like all three of these nations and their major newspapers, these mentions, even though in fact independently they're getting more and more common, so there's more democracy talk and there's more capitalism talk, there's less democracy and capitalism co-talk. So somewhat metaphorically, poetically, these two things are being pulled apart. When, how, perhaps why, what is actually going on? So now, if we were to further develop this research question in response to the discoveries that we've made, right, say, well, look, is this a crisis-driven thing? Was it things like a depression? Was it the war? If you remember looking back at the curve for NRC, a big shift in that R ratio happened right after World War II. So, maybe we want to say, what were the causal drivers? What were the events that might have pushed these two concepts in the public imagination, or at least in the journalist's imagination, apart? Another thing we might ask is, well, is this delinkage of these two ideas, is the tearing apart of these two ideas, is this an idea-driven process itself? So it may not be driven by, the trauma of the end of the war, the fact that journalists were a different kind of person, but it may actually have been an ideological drive. We might want, for example, to track not just the occurrences of capitalism and democracy, those particular words, but the co-associated concepts, so words like money or price, representation, freedom. What are the things that are happening? What are the other kinds of concepts that are in play as these delinkages happen? We might also be interested in some of the institutional questions, right? Perhaps these things are being torn apart at different newspapers at different times, different journalists writing different things. Maybe this is happening more in the sports section. I mean, probably not in this case. Right? So we're asking not just about the concepts, but also the relationship between the concepts, in one case between events in the world, another thing, a relationship of one concept to another. We also might be interested in the relationship between concepts and institutions. If we think we're able to track the ways in which these things are related together, we may be able to make sense of the institutions and how they're doing these. Finally, we might think of these more detailed questions on the conceptual side itself, on the cognitive side. So as people are linking and delinking capitalism and the associated sub-concepts, what's going on in the larger map of ideas that are flowing through each of these newspapers and their underlying institutions? So we've given you here in this a story fleshed out. So we have a research question, we have the operationalization stage. We begin with the question, this broad, almost humanistic question, or at least a question that would be comprehensible to a scholar in the humanities. How do people link these two concepts together? Now, maybe the word link is too vague. Maybe the word concept is not the right one. Maybe we want to talk, instead of how people link things together, how people tell stories in which this and this are involved, how people reason, how people speak poetically, whatever it is. We have some kind of scholarly question. We then have a database or a set of archives. In this case, I chose The Guardian, The New York Times, and NRC, partly because I wanted to have a cross-cultural survey. I wanted to see how 3 different nations did it. I chose the particular newspapers in part because they're a little bit the same demographic over the years, at least in the present day era. We also had a long time span, so we have 1800s to the present day for all of them, enabling us to connect pre-20th century idea structures to contemporary idea structures. Those are our archives. I showed you how to do a kind of operationalization. How do we tell a computer to look for a concept? Well, we do something a bit dumb that seems to often work, which is we just literally count the words that the concept tends to use. How do we talk about the way in which concepts might be linked together? Well, we can't tell the machine, oh, machine, think about capitalism and democracy and, be somebody reading the New York Times in 1940. Can't do that. Instead, we operationalize it by looking at word co-occurrence. So we introduced you to measuring probabilities of words by taking ratios of counts of articles versus total number of articles. And then we introduce you to this second, much more sophisticated idea of looking at the ratio of actual co-occurrence to predicted co-occurrence under a null model of independence. When we did that, we had a lot of fun. We certainly saw the curves of these 2 words fluctuate over time. So we saw these spikes in democracy talk and in capitalism talk at certain critical historical moments. You'd also see long-term trends in both of these things. When we did the more sophisticated analysis of looking at word co-occurrence, we ended up with this kind of fun, let's say intriguing, promising discovery that the operationalization is revealing potentially a large-scale conceptual shift, at least in mass culture, for how these 2 words are connected or not. We've revealed something that was not obvious on the surface at all. It was not obvious to us looking at the individual curves of capitalism and democracy. It was something we had to do a little bit more mathematical study to uncover. This R term here is a operationalization of a rather deep concept of how people are sort of connecting things together. When we did that, we find a set of cultural differences, a European mode, a British mode, a North American mode, or at least a American mode, let's call it. We found these cultural differences, and we found this long-term sort of secular trend of a narrowing of cultural differences and a convergence to, let's say, the American model. And in the American model, capitalism and democracy are indeed linked conceptually, but not at the rates that a Dutch newspaper writer in 1917 would have linked them. So we see a couple pieces here, and let's to be suggestive, let's say, is this a track, or is this a tracking by an unexpected means of a conceptual or cultural shift away from political discussion of capitalism into a sort of there is no alternative neoliberal model? So this kind of trajectory that we've introduced you to with this study, hopefully it's done a few things. One is it's given you concrete examples of research questions, concrete examples of how those questions evolve. It's given you examples of operationalization, counting, and co-occurrence. It's given you examples of visualization. Try to talk a little bit about connecting those visualizations and those quantitative concepts back into the question of lived experience. Talking about, well, it was as if they were independent concepts. We say that when these ratios are close to 1 versus people are tying these things together at very high rates when they're appearing at factors of 10 or 20 or 50 times higher. So this is, for us, I would say, an example of our first Humanities Analytics project. We'll have plenty of exercises to walk through for you as we go forward into developing your skills now.